Almost always when I buy something at a shop, I'm handed a paper receipt, which most of the time, if I'm completely honest with you, just ends up in the bin. But of course, sometimes you need them. How do you prove you've bought something because you're leaving the shop? Or how do you prove you purchased it at a particular date if you need to return it or get something repaired under a warranty? Is it feasible? Is it possible for us to get rid of paper receipts altogether? Let's find out in this episode of Navigating Digital Payments.
Welcome to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline, bringing you the latest innovations, trends, and predictions about the future of payments.
Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the second season of the Navigating Digital Payments podcast. I'm David Daly. I look after the Discovery Hub here at Worldline, and I'm delighted to be joined in this episode by Chris Moore, who is the Director of International Business at Receipt Hero. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. And I think I should share with our listeners that the source of this episode, or where this episode came from, was really a result of a comment that Chris left on a thread on LinkedIn where we announced the publication of our latest Navigating Digital Payments report. And you commented to say, what, no mention of digital receipts? And I thought, well, let's tackle that then. Let's have a podcast episode that goes into that subject. I definitely, Chris, would like to understand what some of the benefits are of digital receipts for both merchants and also consumers. Also, I think good to get your insights and your experience about what some of the challenges are, including on the regulatory side. And then maybe we can finish up with getting your thoughts and your views on what some of the more surprising use cases or developments are that you're seeing. But before we get into all of that, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the company Receipt Hero. What challenge or problem did you guys see in the market that led you to set up the company?
Sure. So, in essence, Receipt Hero is a digital receipt platform. We're born out of Finland, here in the Nordics. Essentially, the platform builds and sends digital receipts in real time. So the moment the payment has been authorized at the checkout. And in terms of where this all started, I guess we came from the expense angle. So the founders of Receipt Hero worked on a previous startup that was developing an OCR expense scanning solution. So if you do have a paper receipt, this application would lift that data from a paper receipt into the platform and then push it to your accounting software solution. So essentially helping the end user with kind of the last mile of expense reporting. The founders, of course, built that, scaled it up nicely here in the Finnish market, but they essentially said that, there must be a better way to do this, right, where the paper receipt's not even involved. You make the payment. There's an API that then sends that data into the service in real time. So, and that was kind of the birth of Receipt Hero, and kind of the next wave in sort of truly digital receipts. So we're not talking email receipts here or SMS receipts, which we kind of call the version 1 of a digital receipt, but structured data that's passed through an API to an application or service.
It's interesting you mention expenses, because for me, that's still one of the few cases where I find myself actually requesting a paper receipt and keeping it in my wallet until I've submitted the claim. But it's maybe a follow-up question there, because you talk about kind of email receipts and SMS receipts being maybe version 1 of digital receipts, and then this progression to structured data. So again, maybe everyone just thinks digital receipts, it's obvious what that is, but how would you define, in simple language, a digital receipt?
Yeah, so we go to the source of where these receipts are generated, which is typically the ECR, the cash register provider. So that is where you would get the paper receipt sort of generated and sent to the paper printer normally. When we talk about it being structured, we mean sort of how that data is formulated in the payload, essentially. So it's not a plain text email where the receipt is then just within the body of a an email sent from a provider. It's in a structured format. So essentially that means that all the products are broken down, all the VAT is laid out correctly. If there's certain product ID numbers, it's all documented correctly. And when it is structured in that way, it can then be sent more efficiently into a myriad of different applications and services. So a lot of the expense platforms don't always want to receive a receipt in a PDF format. They actually want to receive the JSON file of that receipt. So in that scenario, that data can then seamlessly flow into that third-party provider. And it means also on their end, they don't need to then convert it into a different format. So that's kind of where we see this world. I mean, we came from this with a data angle as a core component. Everything on top of that is then just building on the foundations of this data. So that's kind of how we've seen it.
So you mentioned there a few things. It's the products, the product codes potentially. I guess the price for each line item, the VAT breakout, any other information that is typically included in a receipt like this?
So then you've got the merchant information, typically what you would see at the top of a paper receipt, kind of the typical address, merchant ID, email address, phone number. In some markets in Europe, you've got fiscal law. So then each receipt needs to be signed with a fiscalized ID. So that typically flows through as well. We have specifications on how we work with an ECR partner. So depending on the data that they can provide us in a structured format, we can then let them know what's a hard requirement and what's sort of a soft and a non-essential if they can't get that data. But typically what we're looking for is a bare minimum, whatever's shown on a paper receipt to be standardized on a digital format. But if they have extra data that we can then utilize on the bottom of the receipt or within the JSON of that receipt going forward, then we ask for as much data as possible. So it might be that a country is in transition to fiscal law, and therefore if that ECR partner has already started the work on that, we then say, well, let us have everything, and then we don't need to do a multiple integration again to grab that later on. So
okay, so understanding a bit where you've come from at Receipt Hero in terms of starting on this from the expenses angle, and then also defining a bit what you mean by a digital receipt. I mentioned earlier it'd be interesting to understand what the benefits are, and maybe from two different angles, consumers and also merchants. So maybe we start with consumers. What for the end user is the benefit if a digital receipt is issued instead of a paper one?
I think the most evident one is a better checkout experience. So if it's an in-store transaction and that customer's activated the Receipt Hero service in our app or a partner application that we work with, the fact they get that push notification to their phone to say, hey, the receipt's arrived, there's sort of a wow factor to that, which is always great. That, oh great, the printer didn't print, I've received the receipt, and I can walk away with the data that I need, whether it is for the expense angle or for just archiving the receipt because it might have a warranty element on the receipt, and you need a sort of a better refund and exchange process from a customer's perspective. I think the sustainability element is now front and center. We're seeing a lot of pushback with certain consumers that quite frankly think that a long paper receipt is outdated and should be really looked at in more strict measure. So there's a lot of movement to try and push that forward. And then you've got a subset of customers that actually want that data. So what we mentioned earlier, that customers are looking at their personal data holistically. And, if they can archive that securely in a certain service, they can really understand what they're buying, frequency of spend and kind of things like this. So I think it's quite a different angle or a use case for that one. But I think the main elements are feeling good about the store that you shop in. And if a wasteful paper receipt is a thing that really annoys you, then it could be a way that you move to a different store, or you might shop differently going forward. On the merchant side, yeah, so I think there's some synergies there that if a merchant doesn't have to buy paper rolls, refill ink cartridges, maintain paper printers, it might sound quite a small task, but if you're a big hypermarket in France or a large grocery provider, that's quite a sizable amount of either waste or financial operational costs. So, I mean, it was stated that large grocery chains in France can use over 10,000 paper rolls a year. And to see them go from the paper printer to the nearest trash bin is sort of a really twisted sort of mindset to go like, why are we doing this? Is this just because of legacy operational things, or can we actually make this better? So we're now seeing a lot of our larger merchants realize that actually, well, it's not just getting the data from A to B, but it's to improve our bottom line. Like if we can stop that mind-boggling process of doing this this process and shift to fully digital receipts, then it's a benefit for them.
And it's interesting, Chris, because usually if I'm, say, at the self-checkout at the supermarket, it gives me the choice to not print a receipt, and I choose the option to not print a receipt. I've always wondered a little bit what happens if I get to the door with my goods and someone challenges whether I've paid for them. And I guess I could open my banking app and at least show a transaction for the correct amount that had happened recently. But I wouldn't have anything, I don't think, that could show I had paid for these specific items. On the other hand, there are a number of purchases where I think you do feel the need for a receipt. We mentioned expenses and expense claims earlier, but also I think anything higher value where there might be a need for a return or a warranty repair or something like that. You know, obviously if I'm buying a bar of chocolate, I don't feel like I need to keep a receipt to prove that I had that in 10 months time. But for higher value items or items where you might need a repair, I still feel a need to have a receipt. And what I have seen a bit in the market is where merchants will offer to email you the receipt, but that's also not always such a slick user experience, to be honest. Often you're having to provide your email address at the counter. It takes time. You don't receive the email. There's always a delay, so you don't actually have that receipt the second you kind of come away from the checkout. And sometimes as well, I think I don't really want to hand over my email address to the merchant to use for other purposes. And that's a sort of very personal experience from my side. Have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, so I think as the first wave of digital receipts, that kind of made sense, that here's your receipt, I need to sort of identify you, and to do that, an email address is that sort of that piece there. Where we differ to that, and I think where the secret sauce is, we're essentially using your payment card as the customer ID or the identifier to that receipt transaction. So if you've enrolled your payment card via a merchant's loyalty application, or it's your bank now working with us for digital receipt within the banking application, or it's our app, that PAN, the card, essentially becomes the identifier to map that data to you as a customer. So when that is all enrolled and you go through the checkout, it's kind of the same delivery process, but essentially you don't have this awkward moment where you've got quite a long email address and it's a busy store and you're trying to say this to the checkout clerk 3 or 4 times before they type it incorrectly. But yeah, I think it just goes to show that was sort of the mechanism for maybe an ECR provider to distribute and send on that receipt. And I think there are just smarter ways to do it these days. And we're seeing that a little bit with QR codes. So post-pandemic, we're seeing that people are more comfortable scanning a QR code, whether it's a static QR code on a sticker at the checkout, or it's something more dynamic on a new payment terminal, for example. So I think that's where maybe the market goes also for customers that aren't enrolled into a service, but then are wanting that receipt for that one-time transaction, and they're able to get that through a QR code mechanism. So
you mentioned their banking app. So is this something that banks are looking at doing, which is, because at the moment, of course, I can go into my banking app and see a list of transactions. Is there a potential future where I can click on a transaction and see the breakdown and see exactly what I bought?
Yes, yeah. So today we're working with 2 group banks here in the Nordics. It's more on the B2B side, so corporate transactions where a receipt can be sent in real time. But yeah, we do definitely see a day where it's not just the amount spent and the merchant name that you see within the bank app, but it is a full digital receipt of the products and the VATs and everything around it. That's definitely where we see the the sort of future lying. What's probably stifling that a little bit is probably just the merchant distribution. So a large, international bank will need to see a lot of merchants that are now active and sending receipts towards their customers. So I think we're not there yet, but the times are changing. I think market pressures now will probably see a flurry of activity from banks saying that's a great banking feature. We should really figure that out. And we talk to a lot of banks quite often in that space that see the opportunity to leverage the receipt data for personal budgeting features, supporting merchants with maybe loyalty elements within the bank app as well. So how do you get that customer back into the store? But now you know that they've got the transaction plus receipt data. You can see what they've bought there and how long it was and the amount spent. So I think there's a huge opportunity there for banks to get closer to merchants with a solution like this.
And I think, Chris, you've hinted at the sustainability aspect, because I think that's the other, maybe not everyone's aware, but quite a significant part of the footprint of a payment actually is the paper receipt, because there's both as you say, the paper rolls, which are not plain paper, so they have quite an environmental impact, but also that these devices have to have a printer inside them, which also has an environmental cost to produce and manufacture and then recycle or dispose of. So I think it seems to me as well, there's quite a strong benefit there from a society angle if we could push towards fully digital receipts.
Yeah, I think actually the main regulation in France has geared up towards that. So systematic printing of both the payment terminal, so the credit card, the smaller paper receipt, and also the sort of cash registers. We call them product receipts, the fully blown receipt that you would need for expenses. To stop that systematic printing is kind of been now enforced, and I think that's kind of where we definitely see other markets in Europe thinking about that and how to put that into legislation and roll that out. So, but it is crazy. I mean, there are certain payment terminals that now come without, a paper roll portal in the back. So the idea that they still need to send a digital receipt depending on the market they're in for compliance. But from our angle, it's a great segue into, getting merchants to onboard into proper digital receipts, not just the credit card slip, but then provide the full basket product receipts too. So that's the way the market's moving.
And that's I suppose where it does relate to something we've spoken about on previous episodes, which is soft POS. This is the idea of the POS being software that runs on the merchant's own device, and of course mostly there you won't have an embedded receipt printer available. You can still, I guess, print out to a standard printer. You mentioned also this kind of challenge about adoption, and that of course to have a full view of someone's history inside the banking app, you need a very large number of merchants enrolled. So that's maybe one challenge. Are there other challenges around moving towards digital receipts that you've observed in the market, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, not every merchant's using the same cash register solution. So we've done around 40 different integrations to date to get the receipt data out of either very large cash register organizations right down to very bespoke, niche, more domestic solutions. The market in Europe is huge. So there are different flavors of cash registers. Not all of them are online. And the big challenge there is to try and open those partners up as quickly as possible to allow their merchants to sort of activate the service. So typically we like to get a core integration with a cash register partner, which allows not just one of the merchants or the first merchant to be onboarded, but all of their customer base at some point. And therefore that would allow quicker go-to-markets in certain regions in Europe and drive more adoption. But you're right, it's kind of that it's a very fragmented model. On the payment side, very similar. So because we're matching receipts with transaction data, there are lots of payment partners, not just Worldline. So we've then got to sort of work in more of a holistic model where everyone's allowing us to get the data that we need. Of course, we're always compliant with GDPR and PCI DSS compliance and stuff like that. But it's something that's it's a growing market in terms of how to roll that out effectively.
So one of the big challenges is this very diverse landscape, both in terms of payments and ECRs. And in the report, we mentioned the fact that payments is actually only becoming more complex and more diverse at the moment. So you have, things like the digital euro coming, account to account, which I guess also the more ways people have to pay, the more that impacts the challenge on digital receipts as well. You've mentioned a couple of times the regulation in France, I guess, moving people more towards digital receipts. Are there also regulatory hurdles or challenges associated with this?
Well, it takes a few years at least to get that ratified and put into sort of the market. I think France had been looking at that for many years. In Finland, for example, we've been working with the state treasury here, so the tax office, and I think we've been working with them for around 3 years now. And they set a sort of a goal by 2025. They will not transact in a merchant store or location where a digital receipt is not available, sort of in a real-time structured manner. So we kind of de facto became the state treasury's receipt platform provider. We have all of their corporate cards in our system, and we're delivering receipts from those transactions into their accounting platform as well. So that's kind of an interesting one, because the government essentially started to go first to move the market. You don't often see that. You might see them sort of dictate terms and, hey, this is how it should be done. But they've actually been probably the most vocal about, let's be the guinea pig to actually do it ourselves first to get our house in order. And then the ripple effect will be that, well, other big corporates or other big merchants will then go, actually, we should be digital receipt compliant because we still want the state treasury's business. So whether it's filling up the company cars at the biggest fuel company in Finland, or train tickets, or restaurants, hotels, all these kind of things that bubble up on travel expense, they all want to be involved in providing that service and making it easier for customers. Because if it's the state treasury, that's just one use case of many. There are lots of other card holders that would see the benefit, the potential of that. But yeah, I think in terms of other things around legislation, I think fiscalization is becoming a bit more common ground now. So there's a bit of a wave now in Europe that certain markets are really thinking about being fiscally compliant. We do work with a fiscal platform that sort of supports us when it comes to actually onboarding merchants that need that service. That's not our product. We're just there to receive that receipt data and send it onwards. But when it requires actually someone to come in as middleware and make sure that a merchant is fiscally compliant with their cash register, that's something that, of course, we then leverage on different partners.
Very interesting, Chris, to hear that example of a government being the guinea pig, which is how you described it. Because I think sometimes it's important to remember that governments have quite a few levers at their disposal. One is obviously regulation, but this can be quite slow. Another is taxation and sort of tax incentives. And then a third one is their spending plans and any kind of steering, let's say, of where they will and won't spend the state's money can have a big impact, I think. And that last one can be a bit more quick to apply than the regulatory or the taxation changes. So that's interesting to hear that in action. So in a moment, I'd really like to ask you two things. One is any sort of surprising use cases that you've seen or witnessed, and then maybe also what you think could be some exciting new developments in this area. But first, I just want to remind people that if they would like to get in touch with the podcast, let us know topics you want us to cover or give us any feedback, then you can email into us by writing to ndp-podcast@worldline.com. And also, please, just to take a moment to subscribe to the podcast. That way you'll never miss an exciting new payment trend. And also, if you haven't already, please take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. So, Chris, digital receipts, any surprising use cases that you've seen happening with them?
Yeah, so I think there's an emergence now, mainly driven by regulatory factors as well, in the EV charging space. So I think, as we probably are well aware, typically the case has been that you need to download a ChargePoint operator's application, add a payment card, and the payment typically happens in-app. So there's now a movement in Europe to, of course, allow for contactless payments to happen at every ChargePoint. And typically you're not going to retrofit a paper printer. You are probably going to find a digital channel or a digital service to provide that contactless payment receipt. Of course, Worldline and other payment partners can't really provide the kilowatt hours that are being charged and or the other product level data that is needed to be compliant with new regulations. So I guess we are seeing a huge surge now with EV operators trying to find a solution to bring that all together and deliver a digital receipt after the charge session has ended. So we've got a few exciting cases that are now sort of in the pipeline, and we'll happily announce those at some point. But I think, that's a niche that we probably didn't think we would find ourselves in, but it's a growing niche just given by the demand of everyone buying EV cars and the surge now in Europe to provide as many charging stations as possible, really. So that's something that's definitely surprised us. I think also in regards to certain markets that are not as developed as the Nordics. So here we have lots of payment card transactions. It's been de facto here. We don't have a domestic scheme, but the two main schemes, Visa and MasterCard, are available here. We are seeing other markets such as Germany still be very cash driven, and therefore our model of only matching a receipt to a digital transaction is sort of suboptimal. It's not the full holistic package that we should be offering. So we've modified that a little bit. We now can provide merchants with getting a digital receipt for cash transactions as well. So that's something that's, again, surprised us, because in the Nordics it's very digital focused, but in other markets in Europe it's sort of slightly behind in terms of the adoption of contactless payments and things like that.
Firstly, on the EV charging case, we recently published a paper actually looking at in-vehicle commerce. And I think what you realise is that lots of things change when you start talking about in-vehicle commerce, but EV charging as well. Clearly, you don't want a physical receipt printer on every EV charging station, it seems. So whereas maybe you can imagine printing paper receipts in a normal shop where you have one till and everyone is going via that till, clearly it doesn't make sense for EV charging. So it's interesting how the different buying journey changes quite drastically what will and won't work. And then also that point of, we've talked a lot on the podcast before about cash and cashless society, and I think, it's a very good point you make, that for me, if you were to base it on my payment card transactions, you'd probably have 99.999% of my spending I use cash very little. But of course that's not the case everywhere, and of course solutions need to remain inclusive for the broadest possible segment of society. So I think at least for the foreseeable future, accommodating cash transactions is clearly going to make a lot of sense. What then on the second thing that I wanted to ask you, any new developments either sort of just happening or that you're seeing on the horizon that are quite interesting, Chris?
Yeah, a little bit back on the QR codes. So given not everyone is paying by card, and given also not everyone is signed up to a service that is allowing digital receipts, so for non-registered customers, there's a huge opportunity where you could scan a QR code at the checkout, and it allows for any customer, whether they paid with Bitcoin or cash or a MasterCard or whatever it might be, that is the sort of optimal solution for a merchant, because for them they just want to get maybe rid of the paper printing completely. So it's a really holistic solution from their standpoint. I think in terms of market shifts, it's very much a case now of watch the French do their thing with the anti-waste law. So I think maybe next year we'll see some more progress there. I think there might be something on a pan-European horizon at some point. So I think that will also help. So I think the guys in Brussels are looking at France and seeing how that sort of country-specific legislation could be widened a lot. And if that's the case, you've then got a huge mandate to digitalize receipts across Europe and done in a more holistic manner. So I think from a regulatory perspective right down to how is the setup at the checkout. I think a lot of things are moving there. So we're quite excited for the next year. And it's an evolving space, and we love trying to help merchants and cardholders digitalize this process. So.
And that topic of QR codes has come up before on the podcast about it's now, I think, more and more consumers are comfortable with the idea of a QR code, the idea of scanning a QR code, and as we mentioned earlier, often more comfortable with that than having to hand over an email address or go through some registration process, particularly if it's a busy checkout and there's a big queue. So it's quite, I think we're seeing it in a lot of different areas, that type of application of a QR code. And then, of course, we see it in payments generally, that a lot is also driven by regulatory changes, both for compliance but also sometimes stimulating kind of new innovation. So it's interesting to see that mirrored, I guess, with digital receipts. So Chris, I want to thank you again very much for joining us. It was nice to have this quick tour of kind of where Receipt Hero came from, what a digital receipt is, and how that has evolved. And then, of course, understand that for merchants, this is a way of, I guess, reducing their environmental footprint, reducing their costs of printing paper receipts. For consumers, it's also about sustainability, but it's also just a lot more convenient in a lot of cases not to have a paper receipt. And then to understand the challenges, but also some of these kind of new use cases and exciting times that are ahead for you. So it covered a lot of ground in a short space of time, but it's been really fantastic to have you joining the podcast. Thank you so much, Chris.
It's great to be on. Thank you very much.
And that just leaves me to thank you, our dear listeners, for joining us once again for this episode of Navigating Digital Payments.
Thank you for listening to the Navigating Digital Payments podcast, brought to you by Worldline. Join us next time to learn more about the latest innovations, trends, and predictions for the future of payments.